Hello and welcome, I'm ELD, and these are all the black cards from Kaldheim, kicking things off with an incredibly dangerous card for your pre-release pool, Blood on the Snow. At 6 casting costs, you're going to destroy all creatures or destroy all planeswalkers. Most of the time in a pre-release setting, you're going to be getting rid of all of the creatures, but then on top of it, you get to return a creature or a planeswalker with converted mana costs X or less, where X is the snow mana spent on this spell. So, I mean, that is... Wrath of God effects are already very dangerous to play against. The fact that you potentially get a creature back out of this. Now, keep in mind, in your pre-release pool, it's only going to be the basics that you open, the snow basics that you open. They are not, even though they're basic lands, they are not named island, forest, swamp, mountain, plains. They are snow-covered, so you can't actually have, like, you know, a whole mana base of those. I think people will have fun with this in Commander as well. It's another solid sweeper that potentially gets back a body. We've had similar effects in the past, which see some fringe play. Not at the highest tier, but I mean, you know, that's really not what Commander's about for most people. Bloodsky Berserker, 2 casting costs, 1/1. When you cast your second spell each turn, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and it gains Menace until end of turn. And if you're playing a low curve, meaning that you're going to be able to slot cards in to be able to consistently play 2 spells per turn, I mean, it's going to get out of hand fast. Let's say that. Let's go with that. That is going to get out of hand fast. If it happens one time, like if this is your turn 2 play, and then on turn 3 you play 2 spells, you are killing the game. You are doing amazing. So if you have a 1 and 2 casting cost card to play, this is the type of card that could get really out of hand, and I suspect will lead to many pre-release victories with a kind of solid low-to-the-ground build. Burning Rune Demon, 6 casting costs, 6/6, and, you know, it's kind of something they miss with Gristlebrand. People do like that type of synergy. When it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for exactly 2 cards not named Burning Rune Demon that have different names. If you do, reveal those cards. An opponent chooses one of them, put the chosen card into your hand and the other into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. And again, Commander players probably going to have fun with this one. When it enters the battlefield off of a Kalia trigger or something like that, you're going to be drawing a card, getting a creature into the graveyard in order to exhume or shallow grave or anything along those lines. So also going to be really dangerous for limited. Just the fact that it's a 6/6 that draws a card for 6 with flying is very, very solid for limited. A little expensive, but 6 mana is doable. As you start to get more than 6 mana, some games you just don't even get to cast those cards, but most games you're going to get to turn 6, and very often by turn 6 you're going to have 6 mana. Choose a creature. Creatures that aren't the chosen type get -3/-3 until end of turn. A mutilate effect that is potentially totally fine for your side of the board. This is going to play well with tribal themes, so keep in mind that your opponent's changelings may undermine this effort, but I mean, that is a constructed quality card in my estimation. The ability to sweep the board for 4 mana in some matchups is going to be very, very solid. Death Knell Berserker. When it dies, if its power was 3 or greater, create a 2/2 black Zombie Berserker token. So if you are pumping this one up, it will come back for round 2. And that is, I think, an excellent card for limited. The fact that it's a 2/2 for 2 is totally reasonable. That's kind of the entry level. What you're going to need is some of those to kind of contest the board early, so your early drops are not simply just land go. And the fact that you can give this some type of bonus and then get value out of it when it does trade, that can be really, really set you ahead tempo-wise. Demonic Gifts, 2 casting costs until end of turn. Whenever target creature gets +2/+0 and gains when this creature dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. We've had this for less mana in Supernatural Stamina from Amonkhet that sees play in Zuberas, so I suppose we have more access to Zubera stuff, but the extra mana, so I don't think anybody's going to be super excited about this. In limited, it's fine-ish. I mean, it gives a creature +2/+0 and kind of indestructible. It triggers ETBs, I mean, Supernatural Stamina was pretty solid, and it did spawn the Zubera Storm build in Pauper, which is a lot of fun. Dogged Pursuit. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. At common, I mean, that's interesting. I could totally see that seeing play in Pauper, just as a solid kind of bleeding out that doesn't involve creatures. So, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting card for Pauper. Something that can just hold on and grind out games in multiples. It starts to offset opposing creatures as well. If you have 2 of this and your opponent has a 2/2 creature, you're basically just like spinning the wheels there. And yeah, that could be a Pauper card. Draugr Necromancer with that snowboarder. Forecasting costs 4/4. We're off to a good start. That is some pretty beefy stats. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile that card with an ice counter instead, and you may cast spells from among cards in exile your opponent owns with ice counters on them, and you may spend mana from snow sources as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. Oh, wow. That is graphic. So, oof. I mean, you got a 4/4 for 4 that is going to start stealing your opponent's creatures. And, Kitchen Table Magic, this type of card is pretty brutal. Just the ability to kill your opponent's creatures and then cast them and get them back. I mean, that is going to create quite a bit of card advantage in grindy games, which very often the Kitchen Table or the pre-release ends up being that. Just kind of the decks aren't super sharp. They're just kind of playing with what you have. And you know what? If we're playing with what we have, it's probably more fun if I play with my cards and your cards. And that's what that card accomplishes. Forecasting costs 3/3 here. I'm not sure what the final name will be. It's another one of these Draugrs, the Zombie Cleric. And here its boast is going to be returning a creature card from the graveyard to the hand. So for 4 mana, that's an expensive boast. But I mean, that is pretty solid. Returning creatures to hand. It's got a decent body. Forecasting costs 3/3s are not the best, but I mean, they're not the worst. They might be the worst that's playable, I guess. You could have worse stat lines, but you probably stop really seriously considering stuff when they get much worse than that. But, it can get in there. But the fact that you're getting creatures back, I mean, that is something to probably be happy paying the 4 mana. Even though that's expensive, that card advantage can be really strong. Here we go with Draugr's Helm. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 3. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie token and have this attached to it. The creature gets +2/+2 and menace, and it equips for 4. Now, we've seen these equipments so far. Basically, the gist of it, it's not like Living Weapon, where it enters with the thing. This is when it enters the battlefield, you may, so it's a trigger. And it's just a solid option. If you've got the mana, you can get a body. If not, you may play this earlier and equip it to another creature. But those equip costs on these have been pretty high. I feel like they really are designing these to make it so you want to wait, because that equipping for 4 is quite a bit. But, I mean, it's also +2/+2 in menace, which is a sizable bonus. Dread Rider, 6 casting costs, 3/7, and you can pay 2 and tap it, exile a creature from your graveyard to make an opponent lose 3 life. That is some inevitability and a big butt as well. That can stand in front of quite a lot of threats and just kind of inevitably get your opponent, which is why it's such an expensive card at 6 mana. You're probably not going to want to run many copies of this, but you could end up running this as a solid finisher for a standstill. It's really unclear to me at this point how this is going to play out. Probably won't know until we actually start playing on the pre-release weekend. Yeah. I mean, if it's a standstill, that's a heck of a way to break it. I mean, there's not a whole lot your opponent will be able to do to stop that from continually upticking. Or not upticking, but continually ticking their life down. Dream Devourer, 2 mana, 0/3 for each non-land card in your hand without foretell. It now has foretell, and its foretell cost is equal to its mana cost reduced by 2. And whenever you foretell a card, Dream Devourer gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So that's a difficult card to evaluate. On the surface, it's a 2 casting cost 0/3 with a ability that requires you to dump mana into it, kind of a quasi fire breathing. I mean, I guess it's probably fine. Yeah, I mean, you've given your stuff foretell. It's, I guess the place where it gets bad is when you're trying to foretell stuff that's cheap cards anyways. You're not really getting much of a discount. If you have a 2-drop, foretelling it is not particularly exciting. So, yeah, I mean, that's not generally the type of card that I'm excited to play against. If it drew cards or something, like, I would be much more on board, but this is trying to be aggro, but in like a really clunky way. Duskwielder, Boast, paying 1 to make your opponent lose a life and you gain a life. 1 casting cost, 1/2. Generally not the type of card that I'm going to be excited to sleeve up. It gets outclassed very quickly and makes it so you can't really attack effectively. So I would generally stay clear of that. Egon, God of Death, a 3 casting cost 6/6, so you know there's got to be some type of drawback here. Has Death Touch. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile 2 cards from your graveyard. If you can't, sacrifice Egon and draw a card. I mean, that, as far as constructed Magic goes, that's interesting. I mean, a 6/6 Death Touch for 3 with a drawback that is pretty easy to maintain. It's not a difficult thing to get cards into your graveyard with cantrips and fetch lands, discard spells. So, I mean, 2 every single turn is definitely a cost. You're not going to be getting your Gurmag Anglers out there in a hurry, but that's an interesting card. On the other side, if you're not looking for a 6/6 on the cheap, you can play Throne of Death, which is going to mill you each turn, and you can pay 2 and a black, tap it to exile a creature from your graveyard and draw a card. So kind of an overcosted effect, but I mean, it does come down for only 1 mana. And it gets that graveyard milling. So it does work well with Egon if you have multiple in the deck, though that is super unlikely for your pre-release pool as it is at rare. Elderfang Disciple, a 2 casting cost 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. This is an Elf Cleric reprint of like Ravenous Rats and actually, I think this is slightly better than Ravenous Rats. I think Ravenous Rats targets. But I'm pretty sure this effect is a reprint just in a better creature type for many players. Elf Clerics, potentially better than Rats for some decks. Eradicator Valkyrie. I do love this art. I mean, that is really wild. 4 casting costs 4/3, flying, lifelink, hexproof from Planeswalkers. And the Boast, sacrifice a creature and pay 2 to make each opponent sacrifice a creature or Planeswalker. And I mean, that is a pretty brutal Magic card. That is the type of thing that I'd be very, very happy to have in my pre-release pool. Not a whole lot your opponent's going to be able to do about that. I mean, the clock is very significant. It offsets your opponent's trying to race you by having lifelink. The hexproof from Planeswalkers, while perhaps not super important in this set, does make it interesting for constructed plays. It's not going to get taken down by so many of the kind of easy answers that Planeswalkers provide, and the fact that you're not actually expending an entire card. Though it's worth noting, Liliana, for example, Liliana of the Veil still takes this out if it's your only creature. But then that Boast, I mean, paying 2, sacking a creature, each opponent sacks a creature or Planeswalker, just like an Innocent Blood effect every turn for 2 mana. And yeah, that's an interesting Magic card. I like this one. Love the art. It's got kind of like a death metal, like the corpse paint look. Feed the Serpent, 4 casting costs, instant to exile a creature or Planeswalker. A little bit more than you want for that effect. But at common, you take what you can get for removal. 3 casting cost tends to be better for removing creatures. Of course, I mean, the cheaper the removal, the better. But this is totally playable, and it's a nice upside that it can potentially KO a Planeswalker as well. They can be pretty powerful in Limited. Grim Draugr, a 3 casting cost 3/2 that also can give itself +1/+0, and Menace, which is a form of evasion. So a solid enough creature here. Potential mana sink. You're possibly going to have a few snow duels or snow lands kicking around. You got the duels, you've got the snow basics, so these snow covered basics. Hailstorm Valkyrie, 4 mana, 2/2, and flying trample. You can pay 2 to give it +2/+2 until end of turn, but that 2 has to be from snow permanents. And a 4/4 flyer is very significant, but a lot of the time I think this is going to end up being a 2/2. If you do have the mana base for it, then a lot of the time these cards will end up basically having like double evasion. Like you'll swing with your 2/2 and they just won't block. So it's like even if they have a flyer, like they can't really block it because you can just pump it. And then you get to decide if that's the best use of your mana to push through extra damage or just to commit more threats to the board in your second main phase. Via Gem. Nope, I was just reading a card in a different language here. Let's check and see what this does. Alright, so this one at 6 mana is going to return 2 creatures of a creature type of your choice from your graveyard to the battlefield. However, if you foretell it, you're actually going to return all creatures that you control, all creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield of that creature type. So it's going to be fun for tribal decks, being able to bring out a just massive amount of creatures from the graveyard, either recovering from board wipe or just stocking your graveyard with all sorts of goodness. Expect that to be something that you see in commander decks. I'm not generally super happy with this type of card in limited, as there are times when you don't have creatures that you're excited about bringing back, or the game just doesn't allow for this to be a reasonable play. Infernal Pet, 3 mana, 2/2. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, it gets a +1/+1 counter. And flying, again, the lower the curve, the better these cards will be. This is going to kind of incentivize the more experienced deck builders to try and keep their mana curve lower to take advantage of these cards, compared to just dropping bombs and just capping out each turn for just one big spell. Being able to play, you know, a couple of 2-drops or a 2-drop and a 1-drop, whatever it is, getting that +1/+1 counter on there, very valuable, and the flying for the turn can be the difference maker in the end game. Jarl of the Forsaken. Jarl? It's a zombie cleric. 4 casting costs with flash. 3/2 means it's going to potentially make some interesting combat steps. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn, plus it has Foretold. I mean, that's a solid uncommon for limited. There are definitely times where you'll be flashing this in to take out a fatty after it makes a block that just seemed fine. You're just going to get value out of that. They block your 1/1, and then you can just play this and clear their board of that pesky creature. Carful Kennel Master, a Zombie Berserker. Got some hounds with him. Let's see. When it enters the battlefield, up to 2 target creatures each get +1/+0 and gain indestructible until end of turn. Yikes, that is a pretty brutal breakthrough card at common. That's going to be discouraging, I would say, for some games. A lot of the time, those blocks with indestructible end up just being creature removal. Either it creates evasion or creature removal is what indestructible often plays out like. So in the early game, a lot of the time indestructible means that your opponent can't actually block it without it being a total disaster. So I tend to think of that as a type of evasion. And then in the late game, you know, they're going to have to block, and very often those blocks are going to line up very poorly, meaning that they have to potentially throw a couple of creatures in front and, you know, chump block, essentially. Even if they have a 4/4 to face off against your 4 toughness creature, they're not necessarily going to do that now that it has indestructible. So instead, they're going to take their 2 smallest creatures and throw them under the bus and hope to weather the storm. But that card has a really solid breakthrough effect. Koma's Faithful, 3 casting costs, 3/1 with lifelink, and when it dies, each player mills 3 cards. Milling is fairly neutral. One way to think about milling cards is it can definitely create a resource. That's an important thing to remember, is the cards in your graveyard are a resource, like your life total, like your mana, like cards in hand, and there are ways that you can make use of that. So getting cards into your own graveyard can potentially help you, can also potentially help your opponent. Now, there are people that feel like they're hurting their opponent when they mill them, and milling is a viable way to win in some formats, but the important thing to remember is, the cards that go into the graveyard, people feel like, oh, I got rid of that card. I mean, unless there are tutors in the format, it's almost like shuffling the deck, or like taking the top 3 cards and putting it on the bottom of the opponent's library. Like, it doesn't actually do anything. Like, doesn't do anything until you win the game, which is, I don't know if that comes across as clear enough for people that might still be on board with the idea of like milling your opponent feels like you're bolting them or something. But in general, if you take those top 10 cards and put them on the bottom of their library, and then you play the game out and you say, instead of losing when you get to the bottom card, you lose when you get to the 10th from the bottom card, that's basically the same thing. It really doesn't impact the game unless there are tutors in the format. Then that starts to get a little more complicated, because the tutors give them greater access to singletons, which could potentially end up in the graveyard. But that's not your typical limited format. As much as I enjoy tutors, they are largely kind of part of Commander and Vintage at this point. Now, this is what I'm talking about, a 3-mana instant destroy creature, and if it was foretold, scry 2. I mean, that is not bad at all. The foretell cost drops down to 2 mana, and 2 mana to destroy target creature, and scry 2 is an exceptional value. If that was actually a card, like, that could be legacy playable. If it was just 2 mana, destroy target creature, scry 2, that would be a legacy playable card. So, you got to put some work in, but totally fine, and I'm sure this will be solid and standard, and you're going to be happy to have that in your pre-release pool. Priest of the Haunted Edge, 2 mana for an 0/4, so we're off to a shaky start, but you can tap it and sack it to give target creature -X/-X, where X is the number of snowlands you control. On top of that, you can only activate this when you could cast a sorcery. I mean, that is not the type of card I'm going to want to play. Maybe in some type of constructed zombie goofy deck, but just in limited, you're doing an awful lot of work. You contrast this to something like the previous spell where you're just able to eliminate a creature effortlessly. Now, it is worth noting that this works better with recursion, which is probably, if you see it on pre-release weekend, it will be based off of people trying to like return creatures over and over again. And, if they've got a ton of snowlands, that may end up being a powerful effect, but you'd have to work for it. Like, you'd actually have to put in a lot of work. And creatures that kill other creatures are actually kind of the best thing in limited, but you also generally want them to be able to attack and finish a game if possible. Raise the Draugr, 2 mana, and you're either going to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand, or return 2 creature cards that share a creature type from your graveyard to your hand. Graveyard recursion, again, you got to work for it. It's pretty sus. Could end up working out really well. And, some people like that. Some people like to go into a tournament trying to assemble some type of crazy contraption, making just amazingly memorable game states, but I generally just try and win when I'm playing in pre-releases. I'll barely, like, I might add like my last playable might be a card that's a little suspect, but aside from that, I generally do try and build the best deck that I can. I enjoy it the most that way, and I find that that's something that I can kind of build on as I start to understand a set. I can measure my progress based off of how well the decks function. Return Upon the Tide. Return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. If it's an elf, create 2 1/1 green elf warrior tokens. Yeah, I mean, you can foretell it. I mean, I don't know. It's a tough sell for me for the graveyard recursion. It really is. Not the type of thing that I'd be looking to sleeve up in my pre-release pool, but I'd imagine there's going to be some Golgari-themed elf decks that may be fine with that in Commander. Rise of the Dread Marn. Instant. Create X 2/2 black zombie berserker tokens, where X is the number of non-token creatures that died this turn, and it foretells to make this only 1 mana. I mean, 1 mana for this effect is pretty dangerous. Collar of the Claw is a card that people have used in the past to try and deal with board wipes for like an elf deck. And I mean, this is interesting. I could see people doing stuff in Commander with this. I don't know that I like it for a pre-release. Again, it's kind of goofy and fun, not my cup of tea. But I could definitely see this being in Constructed. You know, you have the ability to like sack all your guys and then play this and get a ton more guys. Something like a Skirk Prospector effect or an altar effect where you're sacrificing for either milling or mana and then playing this. I mean, this could have some pretty interesting combo applications for some kind of wacky contraptions. Rune of Mortality. All of the runes, when they enter the battlefield, we draw a card, and they give a creature or equipment an ability. This one's going to be Death Touch. All of them kind of feel like if you can get away with it, you're fine. I mean, you're drawing a card, which is the most important thing. At 1 mana, they'd be too good, and at 2 mana, they're a question as to whether or not you play them. Death Touch is a powerful effect, particularly when coupled with First Strike, but you know, going on to equipment also becomes interesting. Though a lot of the equipment in this set so far is pretty expensive to equip. Scamfar Shadow Sage, that is a little bit of a tongue twister. 4 mana, 2/5, unusual stat line on that. When it enters the battlefield, you choose 1. Each opponent loses X life, where X is the greatest number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common, or you gain X life, where X is the greatest number in the same deal. So you're either gaining X or they're losing X based off of the number of creatures. It's an elf cleric, and at 4 mana, I mean, we have better options, but it's another copy. So Commander, I guess, can consider running this. I mean, elf decks can make good use of this. If this was a common, then maybe you could consider this as a possibility for pauper elves as a way to punch through without needing to do combat damage. But that said, that is not the case. So probably relegated to mid-tier Commander decks. As far as the pre-release, I mean, enters, shocks your opponent, maybe bolts them. It's not the worst value. Skull Raid will definitely be better in draft. I'll say that. Cards like that can be much better in draft when you can like purposely build your deck to be all certain creature types compared to just playing with what you get in your 6 packs. Skull Raid, 4 casting cost sorcery. Target opponent discards 2 cards. If fewer than 2 cards were discarded, you draw cards equal to the difference, and it has a foretell of only 2. So this does address one of the main problems with discard, is that sometimes your opponent just runs out of gas and they're just playing off the top, and that becomes a terrible top deck. That said, it's still 4 mana, so I don't know that it's actually any good. Doesn't really feel like the type of card, again, that I'd be excited to play. Probably wouldn't feel terrible about playing it as like a final card in the deck. But it's all about the battlefield when you're playing at a pre-release. You're generally not doing big battles on the stack and going after people's hands. So, but I do like the art. I mean, that's some really fun art. It has kind of a Krampus style a feel to it. Turgrid, God of Fright, a 5 casting cost, 4/5. This god has menace, and whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Well, that is fairly awkward. If your opponent's using fetch lands, you're getting those things. I think this is It That Betrays has this text on it, so this is a much cheaper version in terms of getting this onto the battlefield. Yeah, I mean, that's a fun card in some people's books. On the other side of it, we've got Turgrid's Lantern. You can tap, target player loses 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card, and you can pay 4 to untap it. So that'll actually with infinite damage, with infinite mana that will kill someone. You can just keep untapping it. Untap effects can be useful for other effects as well. Yeah, I mean, this seems welcome. I mean, a 5 casting cost 4/5 with Menace is totally fine, and it's got a real upside there. And the sacrifice, like, who knows how many different ways that could come into play, but getting extra value is always welcome. Turgrid's Shadow, 5 casting costs. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures with a foretell of 4 mana, and that's an instant. That's a spicy card. So Barter in Blood was a Mirrodin block card, which I recall being solid. I don't know if I'm wrong on that. I'd have to probably talk to some other players from back then and try and hash through. I may have been playing against soft competition as well, but I recall Barter in Blood actually being playable in control decks in Draft. Now that's a different thing than a pre-release for sure, but instant speed, each player sacrificing 2 creatures. The most obvious way to break the synergy on this card is to just not have any of your creatures on board when you play it. After that, you could be sacrificing tokens or things that have dies effects, but there's a lot of power on this card in terms of its effect, and that instant speed does make it more interesting to me, as Barter in Blood and many effects like this end up being sorcery speed, like damnation style effects. I would not be surprised if this sees play in a largely creatureless control deck in Standard as well. Here we go. Valky, God of Lies. This is probably the most talked about card in the set so far. On the front of the card, we have a 2 casting cost, very important, for a 2/1. And when it enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals their hand. For each opponent, exile a creature card they revealed this way until Valky leaves the battlefield. You can also pay X and choose a creature card exiled by Valky with converted mana cost X, and he becomes a copy of that card. So you can basically shift him into one of the creatures that was removed from their hand. I mean, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Like, just 2 mana to get a 2/1 body and also to get a creature card out of their hand is actually going to be fine on its own. Hadn't put too much thought into this side of the card, because what everyone's excited to do is actually cascade into Valky using something like a Shardless Agent, and then you're going to get a free Tybalt Cosmic Imposter. So when it enters the battlefield, you get to decide which side it comes in as, and Tybalt Cosmic Imposter, I mean, that's pretty brutal. You're getting a 7 mana value. Now, he has a lot of text on him. As he enters the battlefield, you get an emblem, which says you can play cards exiled with Tybalt Cosmic Imposter, and you can spend mana as though it were any mana color to play those spells. So that is very, very strong out of the gate, because his +2 is exiling the top card of each player's library. So in multiplayer, you're getting a ton of card advantage there, and in a single player game, you're still getting 2 cards essentially that you can cast whenever. -3 exiles an artifact or creature. Remember, you can also then cast those cards, and then the -8 is exile cards, all cards from all graveyards, and add 3 red. So, I mean, that's a really powerful effect, especially when you're just cascading into it off of like a Shardless Agent. And I mean, it's probably the most talked about card in the set. I don't imagine they're going to change the ruling on this. Currently, as it stands, you can just cascade into this and get insane value, and I suspect that we'll see like Shardless Bug or some type of cascade decks attempt to make great use of this really powerful, versatile Planeswalker. Varagoth Bloodsky Sire, a demon rogue, 3 casting cost 2/3 with Death Touch, and that boast, that's brutal. Target player searches their library for a card, then shuffles their library and puts that card on top of it. So people, I'm sure, will be happy to use this with Opposition Agent. Also, just Vamp Tutoring yourself is probably insane. Like, you're going to be able to just like find time walks or whatever it is that you need. I would probably, like, my mind just goes to Time Walk because then you can tutor up like a regrowth and then a regrow time walk and just keep taking extra turns. If you've got any other support besides this guy, it's also going to get out of hand pretty fast. So, I mean, that's a fun magic card. I don't know how good the boast will end up being. It definitely depends on whether or not your opponent has their own board. But even if they do, you're getting potentially a boast out of it and trading with whatever they're throwing in front of it thanks to the death touch. So, I mean, that one's pretty fantastic. Vengeful Reaper, 4 casting cost, 2/3, flying, death touch, haste, and a foretell cost for those 2 low payments of 2 mana. And I think you're going to be pretty happy sleeving that card up. Even if you're taking turn 2 to foretell it and then playing it on turn 3, it's really not that bad because of the haste. So this card actually seems very strong to me. Village Rites, love the new art. This is a card that we've seen already. It is a reprint, but with really cool art, and I'll probably use this version in Zubera Storm and see if it actually pulls its weight. As an additional cost, you sack a creature and you draw 2 cards. So in Zubera Storm for Pauper, I'm looking forward to playing with this to have an additional sack outlet while also adding in some card drawing. And I may actually consider cutting some of the other card drawing. Right now I'm running Brainstorm as a 4 of and some other card drawing in there. I think I might actually give this a go. Not that I couldn't have before, but man, that art definitely makes me want to bust out some Pauper. Way Down, love the art, love the contrast with the black frame. 1 black is an additional cost. You exile a creature card from your graveyard. Target creature gets -3/-3 till end of turn. It's a sorcery. Yeah, I mean, the sorcery speed kind of hurts it for me here. It is decent removal, but it is conditional, which means sometimes it's just straight up not going to work, and those are going to be really frustrating games. So overall, that's a difficult card to evaluate. My gut says hopefully you have better options, but removal is a premium in Limited, especially when you're able to follow up with powerful plays and just kind of out-tempo your opponent. You know, you generally don't want to be just dirtling in Limited and just like trying to kill everything that they put down. You're just going to want to kind of outrace them. Wither Crown, 2 mana. It's an aura. Enchanted creature has base power 0, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life unless you sacrifice this creature. So they're pretty much going to now have a chump blocker that they want to throw in front just to get rid of it, which is fine. It is fine. I mean, it kind of has that built into the art with the younger successor looking to off the reigning monarch here. And now I believe we're actually into cards from the commander decks. So Cleaving Reaper, 5 casting cost, 5/3. We've got a flying trample creature. And so these are not going to be evaluated in terms of your pre-release pool, as this is not possible to get in your pre-release pool. You can pay 3 life, return it from your graveyard to your hand, and you can activate this ability only if you had an Angel or Berserker enter the battlefield under your control this turn. That seems like it'll be welcome in some Angel commander decks, being able to play an Angel and then return this to your hand from the graveyard. Gives you some staying power, though, you know, a 5/3 without any other abilities is not the most exciting thing. Actually, yeah, so you can return it from your graveyard to your hand by paying 3 life. So if an Angel entered the battlefield this turn and you have a way of discarding cards, you can just keep paying 3 life to return this to your hand. So yeah, no, people will find a way to have fun with this in Commander. So like you could have like a Wild Mongrel out and have like 10,000 life off of some goofy combo and then be able to use this, right? Yeah, there's no other restrictions on there. So if an Angel enters the battlefield or a Berserker enters the battlefield this turn, you can just start paying 3 life to return it. So discard it, pay 3 life, return. Definitely for the best that it's 3 life. That is harder to come by for many constructed formats, but I would imagine that Commander players will have fun finding a way to break that card, kind of making it like a Zodiac Dragon. Elderfang Ritualist, 3 mana for a 3/1. When it dies, return another target elf card from your graveyard to your hand. It's likely a welcome addition to the Golgari family of elves. We're seeing Golgari elves are definitely a thing now. It was previously green, and then you had like Elves of Deep Shadow kind of encouraging you to splash a little bit of black, and Lorwyn had a little bit of black elves, but it's definitely coming back around here. I mean, I guess Lorwyn did try and establish it as a 2-color thing. We even have the Guiltleaf Palace and everything. Renegade Reaper, 3 mana for a 2/3 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, mill 4. If at least one angel is milled this way, you gain 4 life. That is probably not making the cut anywhere, but it would be solid and limited. 2/3 flyer for 3 with a potential upside. Thorn Mantle Striker, 5 mana for a 4/3. When it enters the battlefield, choose 1. You can remove X counters from target permanent, where X is the number of elves you control, or target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-X, where X is the number of elves you control. So, I mean, that's more along the lines of something that I'd imagine people playing in Commander, having the ability to remove creatures, or, I mean, sure, have some fun with like a Dark Depths or something. Or like KO a Planeswalker. Scamfar Avenger, an Elf Berserker, 2 casting costs, 3/1. Oh, this is just part of the set. All right. Whenever another non-token Elf or Berserker you control dies, you draw a card and lose a life. Yeah, no, that seems great. That seems totally great. Gonna draw a card. Totally worth it to pay a life to draw a card. If Magic has taught us anything, is that cards are more important than life. And we are back to Blood on the Snow. So on that note, that is all of the black cards. We're going to go through all of the cards here for Kaldheim, getting geared up for the pre-release. Thanks for watching.